Låt mig väldigt snabbt då presentera Claus Haugaard Jacobsen som är psykolog och professor i Ålborgs universitet och en väldigt flitig supervisionsforskare. Hör ni mig? Det är bra. Han har bland annat ett projekt som jag tycker låter väldigt intressant som handlar om patienters och terapeuters upplevelser av att bli videoinspelade. Men idag så, det kanske kommer nästa år. Om vi har idag så ska vi prata om din värsta supervision. Det är ju så faktiskt att det som man lär sig mest av det är de dåliga upplevelserna. Varsågod Claus.
Tak skal du have. Jeg har besluttet mig for at ændre titlen til My Worst Psychotherapy Supervision. In other words, I decided to speak in English because I come from a part of Denmark where we have an accent, and it makes it pretty hard for me to understand some Swedes. So I guess it works the other way around as well. And then Marie-Louise, she suggested that I should make my PowerPoints in English and then speaking in slow Danish and having English PowerPoints. I thought that would be not too wise to do. But the reason why I'm talking about the language is I'm a bit embarrassed because I mean we have to. I like the idea of we have a Nordic conference and that we're able to understand each other's languages. But on the other hand, I'd like to make my points clear to everyone. So I'll talk in English. Okay, I'll just go briefly through this introduction because Helga has already been talking about it. But the data I'm going to speak about today is apart from the Danish version of the DPCCQ questionnaire. And what we did in Denmark, besides translating it into Danish, was that we made some supplementary questions on supervision, because we already knew that supervision is a very important factor in the professional development. So we thought it would be a good idea to have put in more questions on that. And that's what we did. Furthermore, we know that supervision can be very helpful and a very good and important learning experience, but it can be a negative learning experience too. Quite a few supervisees seem to be dissatisfied with the quality of their supervision, and they talk about it as a hindrance or even sometimes harmful to their professional development. Bad, negative or harmful supervision events have been a subject of study during the latest 15 years. There seems to have been a growing interest in that field. So this is what I'm going to speak about. So, in short, the present study is based on qualitative analysis of the written answers from 252 subjects to the following 3 questions. And this is some of the questions we added in the Danish version. And when I say we, I'm talking about Jan Nielsen and Birgit Borg-Mathisen. She's not here. And we had a lot of help from David Dolinski and Helge Rønnes when we developed it. But the 3 questions are, first of all, what was the worst supervisory experience that you have had as a psychotherapist? And then we wanted to know at which point in the career this bad event took place. And finally, what the impact on the professional development was of this event. So this is the answers to those 3 questions I'm going to speak about. So, very simple, the purpose of the study, it is to explore what is considered my worst supervision through inducing meaningful categories based on the open-ended written statements. And furthermore, to continue the exploration of the formed categories by using some of the quantitative data we already have in the DPCCQ. I'd only just begun doing that, but I guess I'll continue working on that the next weeks to the following weeks. Just a few numbers here. In total, we got 385 questionnaires in Denmark. Of those questions, only 252 filled out the open-ended questions on supervision experiences. This is what is the absolute. It's in the back of the questionnaire. It's a very long questionnaire. I was talking to Claus Haugaard Jacobsen yesterday, and he said, well, if you really want to study supervision and using the DPCCQ, you should put all the supervision questions in front, because people are exhausted when they get to page 18 or whatever. So, but anyway, we got 252 filled out answers. 14 of them were mistaken answers. They were talking about experience as a client, as a psychotherapist, or as a supervisor. So I just excluded those 14. So what I wanted to do was only to focus on answers from the perspective of being a supervisee. So that left me with 240 statements. Oh, that's something wrong. I changed the numbers because I was recounting. I guess. This is the. So we had this written text of 238. Of those, 22 said, well, actually, I've never had a bad supervisory experience. Never experienced it. And 4 more said, I don't know. And that could, of course, be interpreted in 2 different ways. That if you really had, the first interpretation would be, if you really had a bad experience, you wouldn't be in doubt, then it would stand to 4 for you. The other way is to interpret it would be to say there's been several of bad events, and it's very hard for me to choose which of them was the very worst. So we don't know. But left was 212 answers. Said I had a worse supervision experience as a supervisee. I'm not going into that. It's just the theoretical orientation of the total Danish sample. Just to give you an idea. Still, though it's increasing in Denmark, the psychodynamic tradition is still the most dominant. But if you look at the new psychotherapies, CBT has just taken over. The sample consists, the total sample you have here, I'm not going to talk about that, but the valid answers, the 212 I'm going to speak about in a moment. 203 are psychologists, 9 psychiatrists, mean age 48 years, and they've been working as a psychotherapist on an average of 16 years, 16 and a half years. The statements we collected had a length of between 1 and 149 words, and the average was 17 words. So a couple of sentences would be the normal length. Some of the statements contain 2 or more distinct examples of a worst supervision case. And some statements point at several issues that made a specific event to be the worst supervision ever had. A bit about the research process. What you do? Still alive. Well, yeah, I'm still alive. But you know, when you start with all these statements, it feels a bit like this, and then the cloud disappears and it becomes a bit more clear. You can see that there's something here. Something starts to make gestalts. I'm not going to speak much about it, but what I did was I worked in a rather old-fashioned way. I copied all the statements from the SPSS and put it into the words table function. It's easier for me to work in that. Then I read through it all and gave each preliminary headline and name. I read through once more, remembering some of the preliminary headlines, and kept doing that until scoring kind of appeared. So I was trying to sort the headlines into bigger chunks that look the same or just somehow related. When I formed the chunk, then I went back and read all the original statements again to check that they were fair examples of a membership in that category. You know that process. So I kept on repeating it, blah, blah, blah. It's a bit like working in, as it's described in the hermeneutic circle. You go from the whole to the parts and back and forth many times, and you refine and you twist a little bit and reorganize. So that's what I did, and this is somewhere in the mid-phase. I had some ideas, and some of them were then being condensed. Then, at a certain point, something started to make a picture, but then I was a bit afraid. Was it okay? Did it make sense? And I had some issues I didn't know what to do with, because it seems like they belong to the categories that formed already. So what I did was I gave a colleague of mine, actually my wife, she's my harshest critic, but she's a very good colleague as well. So I gave her, no, that's not wrong what it says. I gave her the answers from the subjects, not my scoring, but the answers, 99 answers I gave my wife. And then I gave her the 4 categories I had formed. I thought that many of those 99 statements belonged into one of those 4 categories. And then, additional, I gave her some other answers that did not belong, but somehow seems to be related. I had 3 categories. I didn't know which one of them to choose, so she went through it herself. And the 3 ones I was struggling with was professional incompetence, something like, it's very hard to translate into English. Actually, we have in Danish a word called krænke. Do you know that in Swedish? Yeah, well, it's sometimes it's slights, it's insults, it's offend, it's humiliate. It's yeah. I had a category called insults, something with transgressing borders, and something with breaches of confidentiality. So I wanted to see whether my scorings made sense to another person, could be somehow replicated. The problem, the point was also that my wife, she didn't know that some of the 3 categories, she didn't know about those. So she had this scheme here. The 4 categories that formed had something to do with critique, finding errors, being experienced. The supervisor was not empathizing or understanding me. The all-knowing supervisor, in the negative way, all-knowing, sometimes even belittling. And then a category I called "Do It My Way." If you take this, you have 4 columns here, and you have 99 rows going down. That gives, if my wife made a score exactly like mine, we could have then the same 396 scorings. What she came up with was an independent scoring of mine, where we had 56 instances has just been the same. That gives a rate of 90%, which I thought was fairly high actually. So that gave me a good feeling that it made sense what I've been doing by myself. What was even more interesting was that she invented two categories. She said, well, Claus, I really can't fit all this into this. I had to make up two new categories. And the one she made up was something with unprofessional or incompetent behavior from the part of the supervisee, and something with borders and insults, kranke. So while my three was these, so there's a very good correspondence between that. So with that reality check, I said, okay, I'll just keep on doing the work on myself. So I did that. So the results. And this is a bit tricky photo because, when you're going to buy vegetables, it's rather easy. You have bananas, you have apples. It's not like that in human sciences. It's much more difficult. And the way I present the result is one plausible way of making sense in the data. You can twist it a little bit, It's just when you're doing factor analysis, you can rotate the axis, and you can do the same with these concepts. So, and you have much more overlapping. Sometimes it seems to be dimensions or parameters, but not in one dimension, but in many dimensions. So maybe it can be organized in a better way than I've been doing. But anyway, okay, the first result is that 9% said that they never had a bad experience. Yeah. This is a result. If you include the 2% who say we don't know to the answer what's your worst experience in supervision, then you sum up to 11%. Well, I guess it speaks for itself. But what I did was I checked for how long time have they been working as a psychotherapist. Because if they were novices, that could be the explanation why they had nothing bad to report. But actually they've been working for 2 to 40 years as a psychotherapist, and they have a mean of 15 years experience as a psychotherapist. So they had the chances for having a worse supervision than they thought. So I guess they're just lucky. Or maybe it's not luck, maybe it has something to do with them as supervisees, that they've been able to regulate the supervisor's bad behavior. That's another way of seeing it. Okay, then the next category has something to do with the supervisor giving too little. And that can be done in different ways. For example, the supervisor lacks professional knowledge or skills. Quite a few said, my supervisor was incompetent. The trouble about the word incompetent is that when you rate a supervisor as the one who has given you the worst supervision ever, in a way you just say, my supervisor was incompetent. So it's too broad concept to use, but some said very specifically, I knew more than my supervisor. He couldn't bring me anything new. Included in this category is also a supervisor who seems to be unengaged in doing their job, uninspired or uninspiring. Supervisors who were too neutral, reluctant to speak, to interfere, just very passive in a negative sense. Supervisors who were not challenging the supervisee, supervisors who fell asleep.
Not I. No one died.
No, not that's been reported at least. And then supervisors who didn't structure the session but just let it all flow. And the total number belonging to that category was 28. Examples of supervisors giving too little could be, even though my supervisor was a licensed specialist in psychotherapy, he was professional, insufficient, and theoretically weak. Supervisors who wasn't any better than me and whose feedback wasn't of any use. The supervision was trivial, unimportant. It seems like the supervisor was being bored. That's not a very good thing to experience. The supervisor didn't demand enough of me. Diffuse talk about general issues, not having, the specific focus on the presented case. And finally, the supervisor was completely silent, although I put up some specific problems. That was a very psychoanalytic supervisor in a misunderstood way, I guess, as far as I remember. Okay, then the next category was the supervisor doesn't understand me or doesn't empathize with me. The supervisor didn't emphasize with or meet the supervisee's needs, or didn't understand the case or the supervisee's problems. Total number of 33. Examples of that could be, to show up with a problem that was totally ignored. Instead, the supervisor steamrolled another issue through, which to me felt completely irrelevant. The supervisor didn't at all understand the case I presented. I felt misunderstood. The supervisor gave tons of advice, but was completely unusable because she didn't take time to listen to the case I presented. This one. I was treating a patient with borderline personality disorder who I was afraid of. She was aggressive, acting out. I didn't feel that the supervisor understood how anxious and insecure I was. A patient of mine committed suicide. I didn't feel met or supported. Then there's another category, total number of 23, where the supervisor is being described as being too critical or just looking for errors. Mistakes to be pinpointed. Examples of that category could be a supervisor picked on a bad wording while I was telling about a difficult patient. A controlling supervisor looking for errors. She winded, played, and stopped my tape recording at random and asked in an almost inquisitorial way why I intervened as I did. The supervisor was impatient, critical, judgmental, which made me feel incompetent and shameful. And even worse, it had a negative impact on the therapy. Maybe just like Marjorie Dorman described in her dissertation from 76. Actually, I like this statement for another reason, namely that it's much more relational, because that's one of the problems with these data. What you miss is the relation, the diet, and what's really transpiring in that. I'll get back to that later on. Then there's this category called the all-knowing and the belittling supervisor. Because when you're all-knowing, in the negative sense, you tend to be very preachy, teaching, lecturing, being educational, but in a bad, unwanted, irritating way. And this is found in many gradings, from a very mild form where you just give a piece of advice without listening carefully to the case. Most statements is on supervisors thinking that they know it all or are besserwisser. Sometimes it turns even more negative into belittling, downgrading, condescending, or patronizing. I chose also to include in these categories 6 instances where the supervisees were complaining about their supervisors speaking with disrespect of the patients. supervisors don't like when the supervisors are criticizing their patients, which is a very nice idea. They have made a strong relationship with the patient, and they sometimes feel they have to protect the patients against the supervisor. Yeah, some of this is closely related to criticism, but actually I made the scorings and I made it possible to give more than one scoring, and when you compare them, there was only a few items who overlapped actually. Okay, examples of this. When I had an educational supervisor, I had an all-knowing supervisor who gave lectures, pontificated his knowledge. There's the better end of the spectrum. When supervisor is knowing it all and speaks slightly downgrading. If you go to a much worse example, then it would be my supervisor told me that 100% of what I did was unqualified. This therapist gave up working with children, and I don't know what he started to do instead. He just left that. Or my supervisor once said, "You have not even caught the slightest glimpse of it." One supervisor was described as a greedy, arrogant, and belittling supervisor. The next category is I called "Do It My Way," and this includes dominant behavior of authoritarian supervisors who wants they act in a authoritarian way, demanding that the therapy is conducted in a certain way. Do it my way. This is the right way, or my way or the highway. So they seem to be very controlling in the way of meeting the supervisees. Some of the supervisors even were told to have been using threats to enforce the ways. You can see that from some of the examples. A supervisor who wanted to realize his own project. I should work just like him. An authoritarian supervisor who insisted on me working in a specific theoretical reference and disallowed all other orientations. The supervisor scolded me for not following her instructions. Finally, to be dictated by a dominant supervisor to apply only one perspective. She said she wanted other perspectives, but that was not actually what she did. I felt controlled. Another category, and there's a certain degree of overlap here between this and the former category, is when the supervisor also is the boss or the chief or the manager or whatever. 16 statements were dealing with that. So the supervisor is also at the same time the boss. Many of those statements includes something with power and the misuse of power and even threats. My clinical supervisor was my boss too. He couldn't separate those two roles. My clinical supervisor suddenly stepped into her role of being my manager and hinted that I could be fired. I was forced to have supervision from my boss. She wanted me to obey and made a direct threat that I could be fired, which also is a good example of my way or the highway. Then there's a category dealing with it's a bit different things chunking together. I call it breakdowns in the internal borders of the supervision. The essence of that has to do with the supervision being contaminated with personal or private material from either the supervisor or the supervisee. That could be that the supervisor is being too open about his or her own private or personal life, indulging in telling his own case experiences, transgressing the supervisee's borders for personal or private material so that the supervisee cries or has to admit it's because of my background I couldn't treat that patient better. And a lot of offending, insulting, humiliating, hurting the supervisee, stuff like that. For example, a supervisor who preferred to talk about himself, his competencies, and his own cases rather than listening to me. Another one is my supervisor fell in love with me, but I rejected. My supervisor humiliated me, or a fight with my supervisor. Then we have a somewhat smaller category. I call that breaches in the external frame, and that deals with breaches of professional secrecy or confidentiality. Actually, that happens in 5 instances that the supervisee experienced that the supervisor told something in other settings that belongs to the supervision. And then I added 2 more where supervisors forgot the appointments, and that was okay. For example, my supervisor yelled confidential material from a supervision session at me when we later on met on a staff meeting at the ward. Or my former supervisor used confidential information from the supervision to slander me in the organization. My boss wanted to force me to get supervision from her, but I refused because she was my boss, blah, blah, blah. Instead, the deputy chief did the supervision. However, after some time I realized that she told my boss all about it. Then there's a category dealing with group supervision. From the 212 valid answers, 47 explicitly stated that they took place in a group setting. We don't know how many actually took place there, but this is what we know for sure. Okay. Maybe the number is not in itself surprising because lots of supervision takes place in groups. However, of the 47 answers in groups, 42 points that the worst experience has something to do with the group format. That it was something with the group that made this instance the worst. Again, it's a relational thing, but you can see it from 3 perspectives. First, the group members' contribution to why it became a bad experience. And the 3 answers dealt with that. That could be broken down into minor units like negative emotions when the group is unsafe to be in. It's an anxious place to be when there's conflict between the group members or even aggression. Then there's this unempathic, critical knowing that the group members are very wise in their feedback, not seems to empathize with the problems and troubles the supervisees in. They're just belittling and better knowing, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they're even disturbing, say something that feels to be very irrelevant or bad time or something like that. The supervisor's contribution to that this group supervision was my worst has to do with neglecting the group process, not to structure, regulate, understand, and talk about the process that takes place in the group when there's a need for it. And finally, you can say that something has to do with the supervisee, that they had negative emotional reactions like performance anxiety, feelings of being incompetent. They're much better than me in this group, exposed to ridicule, or just feeling misunderstood. I think I'll skip that because of the time. The small category bringing difficult patients to supervision. When patients have severe psychopathology or has suicide. So when you bring those cases to supervision, you need a much more understanding and supporting supervisor in those cases. And then finally, negative reactions in the supervisee, like feeling anxious, beginning to cry, being ashamed of oneself, feeling incompetent. Okay, we just have to go through just a few slides. Then I was looking at the total amount of experience as a psychotherapist. Now this is the total SAM, all the answers we got. It looks like that. So you have it was 16 years. Yeah, 16 years. So and those who answers the questions on my worst supervision has exactly the same distribution. This blah blah blah. This is how much supervision do you get through your career. And what you see is people continue having supervision through their career in Denmark. I'll just get back to the reason why this is just the same. The point is, you have very experienced psychotherapists here in the sample. They keep on having supervision throughout their career, but the time where they state they had the worst supervision looks like this in the beginning of the career. But they keep on having just as much the same supervision here and here and here. So it could as well have occurred here, but that's not the case. It took place in the beginning, and just as Helge said, it's a very vulnerable period you're going through. So it could reflect that in one way or another. Just the last thing, no worst. Yeah. This is those who said we have no worst experiences. Then I was looking at the impact of the worst supervision. That was the third question. What was the impact of this worst supervision case of yours? No impact, 14%. A negative impact. The majority said I learned something from it. Quite a few. So it seems to be you can learn from it. Whether it's true or not, I'm not really sure about that. A part of the learning was a subgroup I called we became more self-confident. We learned to trust more on our own feelings. And then 18% said, I've been very critical about who I'm choosing as the supervisor. Then I think I'll stop here. I tried to, this is where the quantitative data come in. I've just begun to see whether there's a pattern between who's having the negative learning experience and who's learning something from it, and who did not have a negative learning experience at all. Actually, I was cross-checking with the family background and stuff like that, but I didn't find a pattern. But I'll get back to that. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. We are running out of time. Could I allow just one question? And what? Sorry? Okay. We'll go on for 3 more, or 4 or 5 minutes. Maybe 6. Please. Okay.
Jag tänker på några reflektion som handledare. Det som du sa och det som Helge Rönnestad sa tidigare idag, med att man som handledare som behöver vara lite försiktig och rädd om de här nyutbildade. För att vi också förväntar oss att de kan mycket mer än en smak och tror att det räcker. Så det är lite spännande tycker jag att det var så kort erfarenhet.
Ja.
Vill du säga något? Nej.
Nej, det...
Hanne?
Tack för ett intressant föredrag. Jag tänker du kommer med väldigt många av de samma fyllningar som Jan Karlsson kommer i sin rapportörsamhet att presentera senare. Men det jag har lyst til å høre med deg om, nå er det ikke et spørsmål i spørreskjema, men det som går på hvordan vi forstår den negative erfaringen. For det roper jo på et relasjonelt perspektiv på disse dataene. Jo, det er klart at det er mange veier det gikk, men overfor hvem er det du glipper, som veileder også? Så jeg har lyst til at du skulle si
jeg har nogle flere slides, men jeg kunne ikke nå mere. Jeg synes, et af de store problemer med den slags undersøgelser her, er, at man savner det relationelle, og at det er data, som er dekontekstualiseret. Det jeg kunne ønske mig, det var at lave en undersøgelse, hvor man følger gerne videooptaget supervisionssessioner over tid, og så har mulighed for ved at bruge noget i stil med, hvad det hedder, interpersonal process recall, sådan en metodik, hvor man så får det belyst fra de forskellige perspektiver for gruppemedlemmerne, fra supervisanten og supervisors perspektiv. Det kræver, at man indsamler store datamængder, så man er sikker på, at der er nogle negative elementer i det. Fordi noget af det, der sker, nogle gange så tænker man, er de her handledere eller kliniske vejledere, er de virkelig så slemme, som bliver beskrevet? Eller er det projektioner fra en meget usikker og truet ung supervisant, som oplever verden lidt forvrænget? Og særligt når det er de 3 første år. Og det ved vi ikke. Men måske på en måde gør det heller ikke så meget. Fordi hvis det nu er sådan, man bliver oplevet som handleder eller klinisk vejleder, så må vi, som du siger, være særlig nænsomme for at imødegå det, fordi der er stor angst. Så selvom vi måske ikke er så slemme, som de siger, så opleves vi sådan, ikke? Og nu laver jeg selv ganske meget klinisk vejledning, og nogle gange så tænker man jo også den anden vej rundt, at det her er jo en lidt vanskelig supervisant at have. Watkins, han skrev i 1995 en artikel om attachment styles in the supervisee, hvor han beskriver, hvordan supervisanter har forskellige tilknytningsstile, som gør det ganske vanskeligt for dem at lære noget i supervision, i vejledning. Så det er jo en meget relationel størrelse, og det bliver jo fuldstændig mistet i den här typen av data.
Okej, väldigt kort fråga. Imre, det är den sista.
Den här tredje stapeln är ganska uppmuntrande. Så undrar, har du någon uppgift hur många som hade negativa erfarenheter blev handledare senare?
Nej. Jeg kender en, der blev handledningsforsker. Pludselig så stødte jeg på et item og tænkte, det er da mit eget svar.
Okay. Tack så mycket. Ciao.